the only you. Um, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's Remotely Fireside Chat. My name is Elisa Camahort Page, and I'm one of Remotely's founding advisors. And Remotely is a professional network and learning place and think tank that's all about trying to help make remote work for everyone. And so we're talking to a series of thought leaders and experts in their field around this. And today I am very thrilled to welcome Robert Glazer, the CEO of Acceleration Partners and author of multiple books, including not one, but two books that he's published in 2020, because he's also, as you're going to discover, an overachiever. So thank you so much, Robert, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
I've known you for years, but as we were saying before we got on, it's been a minute since we've talked, but talked live anyway. But to give context to all the folks watching and to our entire conversation, just tell me a little bit about your company, kind of like that meme, how it started, how it's going, and why you started a company and how long you've been at it, because you're an OG.
It's been a while. It's when you always say you've been doing it you've been using that number for a couple of years, and you realize that number is 2 years outdated.
Right.
That's where I've been. So yeah, I think it's been 14 years now. Started the company, Acceleration Partners. We really focus on the affiliate partner marketing segment, on true kind of win-win performance relationships. So we help brands around the world set up and manage those programs. And when we started 14 years ago, our company was virtual out of necessity. We were, affiliates, a very specialized industry. We were coming in with kind of a high-end, senior-oriented team. So we had to hire experienced people, and they were all over the US. And so it started as a painkiller. And I think we thought eventually, well, we'll grow up and go into offices and, pick a city. And we just realized, hey, we like this flexibility and accountability. And we, at some point, said, no, we're not. I mean, that's not the goal, and sort of flipped what we were looking to do. So it's been a great journey. The industry is really kind of heating up. In fact, actually, we just brought on a capital partner this week and are excited to really head into the next stage of growth.
Oh, congratulations on that. I know what you mean. When we started BlogHer, which was at this point 15 years ago,
Yeah.
So right before you, there wasn't much of a market for paying and developing funding for and advertising with bloggers. And so to find people who were in the space and knew that space and were passionate about that space and professional, it's not like they were all sitting around waiting for it. They were.
And look, in San Francisco, you had your best chance of finding them.
Well, yeah. So we started in the Bay Area, and we had multiple employees. Our earliest employees, a bunch of them probably were, but there were also people all over from the very beginning. Later when we launched a really professional sales force, that was launched in New York because that's where all the big advertisers were. But always we had about half our team was always just kind of spread all over. And so we never really knew any different. And it sounds like you didn't either with Acceleration Partners. So what were those unexpected benefits that made you feel like, yeah, this is actually better this way?
So what's interesting is, like, up until I wrote the book, or a couple of years ago, people would ask me to do all this kind of remote stuff, or remote conference or otherwise, and it was still sort of fringy. I think it was actually something we hid for a long time. And I said, I'm actually not like that passionate about remote work. We were actually like just passionate about flexibility and accountability, like a culture based on outcomes. We work in outcome worlds where it was like flexibility, all that stuff. It wasn't like we were, saying like offices are evil or any of this stuff. So whereas like, there was a whole group really focusing on like the nomadic aspect of remote work. And so I was pulled a little bit into that begrudgingly, but because I was like, look, we are remote, but that is the byproduct. Like, and I think, and kind of what I ended up talking a lot about in my book, and as I looked at who's doing well in the shift to remote and who's not doing well, like the companies with good cultural foundations and that did things well are finding that the shift is pretty easy. The ones who didn't, like, again, a micromanager in an office who sort of like looks over people and bothers them all day, like that person really struggles when the people are not in front of them, right? If you have a completely crappy onboarding program and people come to your company and you say, hey, go follow around Steve for the day, like that doesn't work when you move to home. I mean, I remember the time working with this company called Tiny Prints, and I think a lot of great companies did this. Like you came in for Tiny Prints and you didn't even get to your desk for 3 weeks. The first week you were in customer service, the second week, like, it was a full indoctrination program before someone just dropped you in your job. And so I think the remote work kind of experiment is kind of the water going out and seeing who's wearing a bathing suit, for a lot of companies, like, and realizing that, oh, I've been measuring people on inputs and time that they spend in their chair. That's not a great way to measure people, but it's not a great way to measure people if they're in the office or if they're out of the office.
It's so interesting you put it this way, because I've been saying that I felt like the first 6 to 8 months of this, people were figuring out whether this could be done logistically for companies that didn't operate this way.
Yeah.
And they spent the first 6 to 8 months figuring out, okay, yes, logistically we can do this. But then you started to see all these CEOs, and inevitably they were often CEOs of bigger companies saying, but this is never going to work. Basically what they were talking about was culturally. Yeah. This is never going to work. We have to be back in the office. We can't innovate. We can't communicate. We can't build our teams. And I was like, I think that's a you problem, not necessarily.
Yeah.
You need to spend as much time figuring out how to make it work culturally, at least as much time as you did figuring out how to make it work with the internet and the technical tools. I mean,
and under terrible circumstances. Like I joke around that 10 years ago, I think people envisioned remote work as people sitting there, juggling their kids in lap and trying to work. Now it literally is. So, it's not anyone who's working home now with kids homeschooling or whatever, that isn't, and no ability to take advantage of the upsides of going to gym at lunch, going with a friend, using the flexibility to travel. Like you're actually getting all of the worst with none of the upside. People who tend to work remotely before this, like they're very social outside of work. They just don't choose for work to be necessarily their socialization. They might be in a 3 o'clock rock climbing club, every day, and they can do that and work their schedule around that.
Right. Oh, yes. I mean, I generally consider myself kind of an introverted homebody person. I am not generally bothered, but over time, the lack of the fairly regular go have lunch with a colleague I haven't seen in a couple years, or go do this or go do that, not going to conferences, not going to any of the sort of events that are very common ever. I mean, eventually even I am like, okay, I'm not seeing very many humans.
Our employees like to see each other. We settled on a strategy years ago called a hub strategy. So we pick specific cities. And one of the things that people will find out via remote work, and if you ever go do an investment or due diligence, like you hire 40 people in 40 states, you will create a logistical nightmare for yourself from a recruiting, HR, state registration. Like this is the stuff that people don't realize until they get into it, and then
throw in a few people from Canada to really make your life interesting.
Yeah. And then you pay them as contractors, and then you find out that's all illegal. And so we've always hired around cities, and because it lets us, so we can go to that city. I'll go and have a dinner and, we have 36 people, in the Philadelphia area, but the people love the socialization. They like getting together. They want to see their teammates. They do charity stuff. They just don't want to be in an hour of traffic every day. It's not that they are all introverted hermits.
Oh, that's just me. No, but I know.
I'm an introvert. I'm an introvert. Susan Cain, when this started, posted something on her thing about like, have to work from home, can't whatever to people. Like, it's like, this is my dream. I thought it was like really funny.
Yeah. Although I know I'm a little star for human contact when I'm really, really excited that the one thing I do every day, I go for a walk and I reward myself at the end of the walk by picking up a Starbucks. Yeah. And like now, of course, the baristas already kind of knew me because that's been my habit.
Yeah. Now they know you with your mask on.
Now they know me with my mask on. And now I always say when I go to pick up Elisa with an E, and now they'll say it to me, oh, it's Elisa with an E. Like, and I'm like, oh, I have friends. It's like,
they probably say it with a smile. So
they probably do. I am interpreting it with a smile. I totally laughed when I was reading your book. You recounted how you used to think of discussions about company culture, since we're talking about this being a culture issue, and mission and values. And I will quote you, you said they were usually bullshit.
Yeah.
And I had the same exact, I laughed because it was me before we started Blog Her. And then we created a mission statement that we really lived by. And that changed my mind. But what changed your mind, both in observing other companies, because you can't just go off your own experience. I mean, it does matter what other companies are doing. And so from other companies and seeing it in action in your own, what changed your minds about the idea of culture and mission and values?
Yeah. So I really did think it was bullshit, because it was like Dilbert. You go into these companies and there's painted on the wall, we value integrity and respect and all this stuff. I actually have a really funny story. I wrote an article about what fake core values are, and I took a picture from an office I was in from one of these statements that just used every cliche word possible, right? And this woman wrote me from London and said, "Where did you get that picture? I love it. It looks just like our company's values." I'm like, "Well, clearly you didn't read the article, because it was kind of trashing on that."
Right.
But it just seemed like this wall art thing, this perfunctory thing that every company did. And then I actually was so Southwest is an interesting thing for me. Southwest Airlines. I do not like flying Southwest Airlines, like, because I fly a lot, but I admire their business model. I admire Herb Kelleher. Like, just one of, like, if I could have met anyone before he died, I just so impressed with how he just did the opposite in this industry and its success. And so I knew a lot about Southwest business model. I understood the, like, the no hub strategy, the one type of aircraft, finding funny people and using them as flight attendants. And so I was at a conference and the guy was talking about interviewing Herb Kelleher, and he said this stat that blew my mind. It was 1980 to 2000, Southwest made more money than the entire airline industry in the US. And when he was interviewing Herb Kelleher and said, "So Herb, like, what was the strategy, behind this? Like, how did you do this?" Herb's only answer was culture. And I was like, well, clearly this isn't BS for Southwest. So I read Herb's biography called Nuts, which is this incredible book about, how the company did it. I looked at their values and realized they actually do this stuff, like, day in and day out. Their core values don't sound like everyone else's. They're differentiated. They talk about living and working and, like, a warrior spirit and stuff. They don't sound like the cliche ones. And if you hear all these incredible customer service stories of Southwest, there's one I always tell about Peggy Yulee in my speeches, this woman whose son had a coma and they redirected her, put on another flight. There was nothing in the operating manual that told them to do this. Like, those were the values. That was, like, servant's heart, like, wow our customers and just right thing to do. Similarly, you have United Airlines saying, we fly right, we fly friendly, we fly with this. And then because they didn't want to give a guy $500, they dragged him off an airplane, bloodied and beat him, and they lost $800 million market cap. Like, that to me is the difference between a company that actually has real cultures and values. And so when we started to clarify our culture and our values and hire on them and fire on them and promote on them and say, these are the behaviors. And when I started to see that that's what other great companies had, they didn't talk about their values and culture. They acted on it. That was sort of the turning point for me.
Yeah. And to me, it's about the Southwest story, which I've also read some about it. And I would say being in California, Southwest really is, like, the best way.
Well, you're in San Jose there. Yeah.
It's the best way to get to a lot of places that are within.
I just like getting on the plane first and not fighting for a seat, because I travel a lot.
Well, that's why you do. But you can do that business
you do
select.
The plus thing,
Business select, or you do that automatic early bird. You pay $15 each way, and they will at the 24-hour mark, they will log on for you and get you. So I'm always in the first or second group, so it's fine. My sister and brother-in-law met on a Southwest flight. So
even better,
because he could pick 6 foot whatever of him to sit in the middle seat, because they had exchanged looks, and he could pick to sit next to her.
That's pretty. The last time I landed on a Southwest flight, again, perfect example, was 17 minutes early. And the pilot says, just so we know, we're 17 minutes early. So next time we're late, you owe us. Just remember that.
That's funny. Now I lost my track of, culture. So the thing about Southwest culture is those employees are empowered. They're
Yes.
not just, it's not just words because they're not living by just an operations manual.
They're empowered, right? But it's not a manual. I mean, you hear these stories,
Right.
they take employees home and, take customers home in snowstorms. And it's not, no one told them exactly to do
Yes.
that. It's just the behaviors that, are expected.
And so that's driven because then there is neither negative accountability for doing something outside the box, and
Right.
there's actually positive reward for
Right.
doing.
What you slap hands on, people won't do, and what
Right.
you reward,
Right.
you attack a whistleblower, you have no whistleblowers. Like, I mean, this is very logical behavior.
Well, we're seeing this just this week with Google. They hire
Yeah.
someone who's an absolute expert in bias in artificial intelligence, in ethics in AI, and ethics in
And then fired
technology,
her, right?
and
Yeah.
then fired her because she was calling them on something. And of course, there are differing stories, and it's quite early in this phenomenon. But I mean, you can read the emails and say, well, isn't that what you hired her for? Partially, if you hired her to be a yes person who was happy with every
Yeah.
decision you made, then what was the point, right? But there, and I think this brings up what my next question was, which is I here in Silicon Valley, I don't know if you experience this, but sometimes people use culture then
Yeah.
as a bit of a blunt instrument to make sure that they keep homogeneity and they keep sort of this they don't get anyone who challenges the status quo. They don't get anyone who asks questions. They don't even get anyone who brings a different perspective. So culture fit is used, and I think it's kind of code for I'm
Yeah.
uncomfortable. This person isn't like me. So how do
Yeah.
you avoid that? It's kind of a hard question about how do you not have the negative happen, but like, how do you avoid culture becoming a barrier to evolution and variety of perspective?
Yeah, look, this is interesting. And look, Silicon Valley has done a ton of damage to the word culture because I think it was defined as ping pong tables and baristas and things that were designed to keep you at work, which is not culture. And maybe it's a semantic thing, but I disagree with this culture fit argument, but I agree. So I'll explain both. But
Okay.
yes, I hear a lot of the criticism around culture fit. And I think if your definition of culture is like a cult, which is that everyone needs to, it's like a religion, you need to not question, think the same, then yes, then that is a lot of problems. But I don't know whether people say culture add in, like I don't think playing the semantics is the answer. I think it's more definition. Like when I say culture fit, it is someone that shares our values. Part of our values are to challenge and find a better way to do it at our company. And we do not like as a leadership team, we get into it, like, but always respectfully. And but I similar to like a marriage or a relationship or a partnership, I think that if you don't have aligned value, you can be super different. Like you can be different and opposite and
Yes.
not the same hobbies. But if you're not aligned on the big stuff from a value standpoint, it's not going to work. So I really see it as not people that look like carbon copies or say yes, but I see culture fit or someone being a good fit for the culture as an alignment with the core values, because I don't think it works if you don't have alignment in the core values.
Got it. Um, do you do anything in your process of hiring or the review process to, I guess, be mindful of bringing in to sort of face head on this issue, to
Yeah.
face head on the diversity and inclusion issue? Like, what are some of the things you do to make sure that you're actually acting on that? Which I agree with your definition, but I think sometimes it's harder, to
Yeah.
operationalize that.
So we try to remove the whole interviewing process is full of bias. And I spent a lot of time with Jeff Smart, who's sort of the top guy in the world on interviewing and wrote Top Grading and the Who book. And his philosophy, in which I've come to adopt, is that you need a process that sort of pulls out the human bias. And so like our interviews are deconstructed around certain things. So first we're going to do a basic screen, and then it's really heavy on the core values, behavioral based questions on the core values, and then on the aptitude of the actual job, something like what you are going to do. And even on the core value questions, the interviewers will say, this is what a 10 answer sounds like, and this is what a 1 answer sounds like. So one of our things is excel and improve. So if I say to you, Lisa, like, tell me a time in the last year where you took a course, read a new book, wanted to learn something, and you were like, nothing, can't come up with anything like in 3 years, like nothing about you personally, but that's not going to work very well, in our culture. So everyone asks the questions, they do the numerical scores, we tie it up to what we said we're looking for, they come as a committee, because what happens is people say, oh, well, like I liked Sam, but his attention to detail wasn't good. Well, if attention to detail was the most important thing, then you have a problem. And then we have sort of an unbiased person at that table, like who's not, doesn't need to hire. Because a lot of teams like, try to talk themselves into hiring someone they need. And they say, look, I'm looking at what you said the rec was, I'm looking at your answers. Like I see pretty big, disconnects in that. So, for us, that process is just trying to make it the whole thing. And to us, it's all the process. How you respond to the emails, how you follow up, do you show up on time? Like people ignore a lot of signs that happen in between the interview. Like if some people are really difficult in scheduling calls and all that stuff, like these are all red flags that you should do. So I think we try to make the process itself not have bias. And then I think now there's a lot of attention on, and look, our industry is has homogeneous aspects of it, of how do we go to different places and find different candidates to put in that funnel, but let's not change the criteria. Let's just make sure that like who we're interviewing represents a broad spectrum, and that we're also looking at the data like to make sure there aren't abnormalities, or we're not different candidates are being looked at a different way, or people are more likely to hire someone that looks like themselves, and the data is kind of helpful in that.
Yeah. Now I can go the opposite way as well. You can you can ignore red flags, or you can over fixate on the one great sign. One of the less great hires I ever made pretty early in my tech career was someone I just vibed with personally. Like we really related to one another, and our interview ended up just being sitting there chatting and having this great conversation. And I just loved her. And, but that was, I got distracted down that path and multiple people interviewed her and nobody raised a red flag and everybody liked her, but she was just incredibly personable.
Yeah.
And I personally related to her, and then kind of got in and realized that's how she was in the job too. Like always talking to people, everyone loved her, super charming, and couldn't think of a thing she did. Like couldn't.
That goes to, right. I think that goes to some of the bias too. And in terms of, again, I said, we give everyone, not on third party tests, we give them some activity that mirrors the actual job that they'll have to do under the actual circumstances. So let's say I give you a messed up client report in 30 minutes to respond to it. And some people are like, I can't do this anymore. I'm like, that's exactly what happened. So the people that do this well, do it well. And I think what you're talking about happens a lot too. I think people that are charismatic in the interview process, like, I think introverts probably get a little bit more discriminated against. And I think people who are super charismatic get more credit, than they should. And some of our biggest disasters have been overly charismatic people. Yeah. But that's why we turn everything into a number, right? Because what happens is that it moves it from, oh, I really liked Lisa and I would have a drink to her, to I'm looking at all my answers and my scores, and you know what? She doesn't have Excel skills, and there isn't attention to detail, and she hasn't worked in an agency before. And so like, these are actually all really red flags about how she'll do here, even though I liked her as a person.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So when your latest book, you've just expanded, you published an ebook on how to thrive in remote workplaces. Now you're blowing it out bigger, right? You're expanding it a bit. So it's interesting to me to imagine how you take the lessons you've learned and what format you decided to take to try and help other people. And yes, Chris is reminding us, if you have any questions, whether you're watching live on Facebook or whether you're watching in the Zoom, use the Q&A function, use the comments. We will be happy to do Q&A. So please do. And Robert's got a wealth of knowledge just in the function of trying to share your wisdom around this remote team management and how to thrive in a remote workplace. How did you wrangle that topic for an audience, a more general audience, to take your personal and professional experience and sort of try to replicate it, help other people replicate it?
Yeah, I think when the pandemic started, sorry, the sun is like now hitting my screen at a weird angle. I'm okay, should go away in a minute, but I'm coming a little bit of an apparition here.
Yes.
Um, see, look at that. This happens. Funny, it happens every day at about this time. I'll have to
What
figure
time
it
zone
out.
are you in?
I'm East Coast.
Oh, so it's, yeah. Well, and it's winter, so
Yeah, it
it's
went away. Yeah, it's some the sun hits at a very specific angle and it
okay.
like does something to
That
my
was
camera.
quick.
It was quick. It passed. Um, yeah, what happened was as soon as the pandemic started and we'd been doing this for a while, I offered to do some free talks or whatever would help. And I did these talks and I was getting the same questions. And every time I get the question, I'd sort of add it to the talk. And then I went to my publisher and I said, people are asking me more about this stuff. And I'm not in the business of consulting, on this stuff, but I'd love to share what we did. And I was like, but I think I can turn this talk into a book pretty quickly. And so we said, and they said, look, we get an ebook out. We can't get a physical book out in 90 days. But, the typical publishing cycle of a year just doesn't make sense at the speed that things move these days. So we wrote it in 90 days, got it out. Everyone that was asking me the questions, I gave it to them. I'd rather sometimes write once and answer, for many, and just felt like we had some learnings from this playbook. And I just saw a lot of people not doing it right. And I think, seeing how they could do it. And then I actually ended up selling the book to a publisher who's launching it globally next year. And we like tripled the size of it and added a bunch of interviews and talked to a bunch of CEOs. Did that in another 90 days. And really went from sort of like, what do you do now to like, when the pandemic's over, like, what are you going to do? And you have some different strategies to think about. And I really believe that people need to be super intentional after this is done. Like, are you telling people they're coming back to the office because some of them aren't going to want to? Are you telling people you're going remote? And a lot of those people were dying to get back to the office. Or my fear is hybrid will be one of the biggest mistakes where people try to just go for the in-between without any clarity. And I'm not saying you can't do hybrid, but to me, hybrid has to be a strategy, not the absence of a strategy. Like, because you'll start to have stuff like, oh, well, they said we could do whatever we want, but like, everyone keeps going in for the Wednesday meeting, and I don't really get called on Zoom, and so people will start to sort of figure out how that works.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because I feel like one really good side benefit of everyone being shoved, everyone meaning information workers, people who are basically sitting at desks working on computers, is that now everybody knows what it's like to be the remote one. Because after we were acquired, after about a year, I was the last remaining executive who was sort of working from a home office. And we had a very remote work culture, but the acquiring company did not. And so a lot of people were experiencing what it's like to be maybe the one person in the meeting who's not there in person, or the two people in a meeting of 10 people. And now everyone's getting thrown into experiencing what it's like.
You don't want to be the outsider.
You just don't.
Every CEO I interviewed actually said that. I said, what was the biggest surprise when your organization had to go remote? And they said it democratized everyone. Like, everyone was on the same page, same thing, same screen size. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was a good thing. And hopefully people will retain that empathy if they do go back and they do end up having hybrid. I mean, I hope they will remember what that was like. I always thought that was something that allowed me to be a really good manager and leader, is that I came up during the dot-com boom time. So I went from being an admin in a marketing department to a senior director of product management in a tech company in like a really short period of time, 4 or 5 years, because of how dynamic the environment was. And so I was never that far away from being the most junior person in the room. And having that memory of what that was like and what I cared about and what things really struck me as positive or negative, I think was really useful when managing other people. You brought up something way earlier in our conversation that I want to circle back to, because you talked about, hey, if someone's a micromanager remotely, they were probably a micromanager when you're all in the office. But you also talked about, using numbers and accountability and setting and achieving goals. So I'm really curious, when you're talking about managing your remote teams, how you communicate the concept of accountability, and what do you tactically provide to prevent that from crossing over into micromanagement? Like how do you walk that line?
Yeah. So delegation always requires more work up front, which I think
Yes, which
people
is why I tend to avoid it sometimes on certain
struggle
things.
with it
Yeah.
because now I need to say, okay, here's let me communicate my goals for this more. Let me communicate our communication cadence around this when I want to check in. What you have in order to not just you know bother people. You need to set
Yeah.
all that stuff up front, and so I think to me it's this outcomes and communications, like focusing on like here's what I'm looking for by this time frame and the outcome. Like I don't have to worry about how you're doing it if we're clear about what we're going for, and here's how we should communicate around this, and here's how I'm available for questions. And look, I'm trusting you to do this, but I'm also here as a resource. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people rush and don't give instructions. They're not clear. So I just think this upfront clarity, and everything I've talked to, including the CEO of one of BP's largest, British Telecom's largest group in the book, was just talking about how they realized how much they needed to switch their metrics to outcomes, right? And how much they just needed to be more outcome oriented, which we understand in sales, right? I mean,
Right.
I don't care how many calls you make a day as a salesperson. That's a diagnostic tool. If you sell 0 sales in the day, I may say, well, Lisa, let's look at your call log and your email log and whatever. But if you sell $100,000 that day, I don't ask you how many hours you worked, right? I mean, you wouldn't take the salesperson who worked 8 hours and sold 50,000 over the one that worked 3 hours and sold 100,000. So outcomes are easiest in sales, but I think, we've tried to define them for all areas of our business. So in client service, it's, are the clients happy? Like what percentage of the things require escalation, to other people on the team? That shows your ability to deal with those things. So, if you're keeping your clients hitting their goals, if you're keeping them happy, if you're not needing to escalate everything, these are a lot of the outcome metrics that we know produce good financial results.
Well, you make me think of two things. And the first is what you said. I really want to pull out what you said and said, as a manager, making sure your people know that you aren't just there to be tracking
Yeah.
their outcomes, but you're there to help support them achieving
Right.
the desired outcomes. It's a two-way street, and it's a positive. It's not just an overseer. It's someone to back you up and help you out. And I think so often people don't look to their managers. I would say to people so often, so why didn't you bring me into this conversation earlier? Like you struggled with this way longer than you needed to. I understand people wanting to be autonomous and prove, but sometimes I feel like people put off getting help with a problem because they don't
Yeah.
want to look weak. And instead the problem gets worse.
And that's for the manager or leader to say, like, I trust you, but I'm
Yeah.
here.
But
Like,
yeah.
do you want to do a 15-minute, morning check-in? Do you want to you don't want to do the work, be like, this is your problem, like not
Yeah.
my problem. So I think I'm available, I'm here to help, but
Yeah.
we're clear about how we're communicating about this. You're clear about what the goal is. You're clear about what the timeline is. You're willing to ask any questions around the project that you don't
Yeah.
understand. Like I always say, like, and this is my philosophy with any service provider I work with or otherwhere, but and we'll just use whether it's months, it's Monday. Like if there's a problem, like, and we're due Friday, like, I don't want to hear about the problem on Thursday night. Right. I
Correct.
mean, like,
Yeah.
let's talk early so we know where we're off
Yeah.
track. Like, don't call me on Thursday night and telling me everything you could have told me on Tuesday.
Yes. And I often also, another trick I used to use, or a tip I have for when someone comes in and they are telling you a story, I often will stop them in the beginning and say, just so I can put this in context for me, are you looking to vent? Are you looking for
Right.
solutions or
That's a
ideas?
great,
Or
yeah.
are you going to want me to take an action? Do you
Yeah.
need me to, are you escalating and I need to jump in? Because you don't want to come at someone with the response that wasn't what they needed or wanted. And it's hard to read people's mind. And so, and by the way, framing it that way in the beginning helps them frame how they're going to talk to you about it. I think the problem with delegation sometimes is that you've got a little bit of I know it when I see it problem when you've been working on something so long where to have to stop and actually explain it requires this kind of
requires more work. I think every new manager I see like gets so excited about delegation. They give people little instructions, send them off, they screw it all up. They come back and they go, this is why I can't trust people. I need it all myself. Like it is that you watch the same. What they don't realize is like, actually, when you get that new employee, it's going to be twice the work for a month until it gets better, until they're sure about they're trained and how you want it or otherwise. That is the constant cycle of new managers that I've seen.
Do you feel like if you're making sure people understand what their outcomes are, do you have a process where you always tie it to their manager's outcomes and their department's outcomes and the company's outcomes? I felt like that was something we learned as we went along with BlogHer that really helped with objective setting, which was to have people understand why their piece of it mattered all the way up the chain to the biggest level.
Totally.
Goals.
I mean, this sort of is the Traction, EOS, Gazelle's OKR. They're all sort of the same thing, which is, we have that all public. We have our company goals, our quarterly goals, like everything in the system. So you see how you're carrying this little piece of the bigger bucket and it rolls up and it's red or and it's green or it's yellow. And so, that creates a fair amount of accountability. Like I was saying that, I think I was saying in the book, like I was giving an example of exactly that, saying like, look, if you just say to your team, we need to increase our bench strength this year, right? Everyone goes, yeah, we need to do that. It won't get done, right? But if you say we need 50 eligible, next level people, and we have 25 managers, and so there's a goal of 50 and each of you have 2. And so what's going in the goal is 50. And then there's little boxes with Elisa's 2 and Steve's 2 and whatever. And like, now we're going to see like we're 24 and because you guys all didn't do what you need to do. And I think people are less likely to let the team down when they also see that it's part of a bigger goal.
Right. Something that you bring up in the book, you're a big believer in consistency, repeatable process systems, which all sounds great. And I've been a process person through much of my career, but how do you balance the benefit of all of that with the risk of creating bureaucracy basically that slows you down? Like how do you balance all of that with looking for out of the box thinking and brainstorming and ideation?
It's a great question. And I think actually this ties to our sort of core values too of excel and improve. So we just actually, it literally ties to excel and improve. So we say, look, we have a process for everything. If you haven't done it before, use our process because it's more likely to get a better outcome, protect you, keep you safe, right? At the same time, any process can be made better. What we ask you to do is, if a better way to do it is not to go do it yourself and freelance it, but like upgrade the operating system for everyone, or come to us and say, here's how we make it better so that it can be better for the entire, organization. So, we are very process heavy, but like no one will ever say the death phrase of an organization is because that's how it's always been done. So that is not what the process does not exist, should never exist because that's always been done. The process should exist because this is the best way that we know how to do it right now. But if there is a better way, then we should do that instead.
Right. Although I will say there was something frustrating I found in running our business that there was no always been done, because every year we had to revisit and upgrade and
but that phrase just like strikes at my soul. It's always been done that way.
Yes,
that's an answer.
So like that almost isn't possible. But that being said, we were around for 9 years before we were acquired, and we learned some things. We had tried many, many things. We had done a lot of different approaches. And that was something we kind of had to learn how to communicate. Of course, new people come in and they would use that phrase like, well, we can't do it just because that's how you've done it. And I'd be like, well, that's how we did it the last couple of years after 7 years of learning and improving. So I also don't want to discard something that we're doing a certain way just because it's the way we're doing it. Like, I feel like there's a tension there too, a little bit, which is that sometimes
is this the right thing to do, right? If you know that it's a better way or otherwise, then it should be, it shouldn't be relevant for if you've been doing it that way for, if you're implementing a process that is the wrong solution, that should never be, to me, the process to help you when you haven't done it before, or you're stuck, or you were going to take a guess at it. And if someone's tried it or done it or has a way to do it, that seems safer, right? if you know what you want to do and you're sure about it, or you think it's better, then yeah, that's different.
I want to apologize in case any of this noise is bleeding over, but my gardener is here leaf blowing. So
We had that a few weeks ago. It was nonstop leaf blowing on our street.
yes. So here's something that I think, I don't know when you wrote most of your book. You had something in there about being a big believer in video and the value of video communications.
Yeah.
You kind of bring remote people together. But now, of course, 9 months into this pandemic where we're all on video all the time, you hear so much about Zoom fatigue.
It's real. It's real. Yeah.
So I will start by saying learning that I could hide my self view was the most important learning I had. I did not realize that. I never had to think about it when I was on a few Zooms a week. I never thought much about it. But when I was on Zooms all day, every day, I was like, oh my God. So learning to turn that off was a big help to me. But what are your thoughts on Zoom fatigue and how to address it balanced with what video does bring to the table?
So it's a great question. And before COVID, I almost said before 9/11, before COVID, we had sort of an always video policy because we were all remote and that was sort of our social interaction. But, we were traveling and going to, all the other stuff. Now with all the stuff that was in person, coming to video, it is right. You get to the 4 or 5 hours and it's too much. So I've traded, and I've encouraged people to trade a lot of those internal calls or ones where you already have the relationship to the cell phone and go for a walk around the house, go outside. Like I've actually done our 90-minute leadership meeting, walking a 5-mile loop for the last couple of weeks and on, because it's been nice every day. And I'm like, I gotta get out of the house.
Awesome.
And I hasn't been distracted. I walk on something where I can, look at it. And then the other tool is asynchronous video. I think, the ability to just record something, and a lot of times it will save you. You could write a 45-minute email or just be like, hey team, I want to update you. We had a couple of big wins this week and send it out. And then people can watch it on their own time. And you're not getting everyone together to listen to you talk about something. So it gives a little more freedom. So those are my tips. I have no scientific data to back this up, but it seems like 4 to 5 hours in a day is where the Zoom fatigue, really starts to kick in, and more than an hour or two at a time.
Yeah. I love that idea of asynchronous video and video messages or audio messages, which now I think I have to think about that. I have to start leveraging that more because I do spend too much time sometimes on emails, and I think it would be easier for me to talk. So I'm going to thank you for that. I wanted to,
it's a huge time saver too.
Yes. The last major question I have, and again, if anyone watching has questions, just throw them in there or put them in the comments if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. So your other book, because you had to write 2 books this year, is called Friday Forward, and it's based on a newsletter that started out as an internal employee email on Fridays, turned into a newsletter. It's now massively popular, and it talks. I don't use the word inspirational very often, but it's clearly inspirational. It talks about values. It talks about ethics and your perspective on it, and you're very transparent about your perspectives. And I think that's what motivated me at this point, some time ago this year, to actually write you back one week and just say, I really appreciated this. And so what started that? What made you decide to go public? And what is we hear so much about, I talk a lot about being an activist leader, about being values-based leader who takes a stand on things, and that's what people want. That's what employees want. That's what customers want, is to know what kind of people we're working with. So tell me the journey of Friday Forward, because I think it's so.
It was kind of an accident. So Friday Forward started as I came out of a pretty intensive leadership program. There was a lot of discussion about improving morning routine, sort of reading something positive, writing, having some time for thoughtful reflection. I did that routine, for a few weeks. One of the things that we were given was like kind of some rainbow and unicorny positive stuff to read. It wasn't just not my cup of tea at all. So I decided maybe I could merge these two things, the writing, and I just had a few stories and quotes and things that I had collected. And so one Friday, our team was remote, about 40 people. And I just sent this note. I think it was titled Friday Inspiration. And it was just a story or a reflection or a thought. And I sent them out for 5 or 6 weeks. I didn't think anyone was reading them, but I was enjoying writing them. So I kept writing them. And I did start to get comments back that, hey, I went and did this, or this encouraged me to do X, or interesting, like I sent this to my wife's company, or, my brother, I sent this to my brother and his family. And it was clear that it was like going beyond the company. And then at a couple of weeks later, I was at an event with a bunch of other entrepreneurs, and we were talking about best practices. And I said, I have this remote team of 40, and I started sending this thing, and I've messed around with it and changed the name. And you should try it. I've gotten good feedback from people, and a bunch of them say, oh, great, well, send it to us. And I added them to the list, and one started his own, I think still does it till this day. And the others, like any good entrepreneur, said, this is great, we'll just send this to our team. And so I knew people were sharing it outside. And so one week I decided I was getting a hard time just managing it via BCC. So I set up a very text plain newsletter system. And I threw a couple hundred friends and family on, and figured I'd get all these, what the hell is this? Take me off replies. And I got the same positive replies. People started sharing it. Someone wrote an article in Inc. saying this is the only newsletter I ever read. Suddenly I saw 2,000 people sign up. I made the old ones available, and it just sort of took off from there. So I got a lot of pressure to, tie it to the company. It's never had any commercialization at all. And I realized if I could just create value for people, then I'd get some sort of value in return. I didn't really have to worry about a quid pro quo.
Yeah. And the thing I'm kind of curious about is that as you were getting pressure to tie it to your company, and as do you feel like you've gotten increasingly transparent? Do you feel like that things have changed in the last year to the nature of what you're talking about? And how was that tied to your personal values?
Yeah, look, I've had to take more risks. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories came from anecdotes of traveling and meeting people and whatever. None of that's happening right
Oh,
now.
yeah.
I'm not having any new experiences,
Oh my God.
with
I didn't
anyone. So
think of
look,
that.
there's a lot to reflect on, that's going on in the world in COVID and otherwise. And I think someone once said to me, if a speaker doesn't, someone doesn't hate a speech, then no one will love a speech. And I think you can't try to keep everyone happy. I get 100 replies, and you'll see people say, this is the most important thing I ever read. And 5 people say, you're an absolute moron and an idiot, and whatever it might be. But the thing that's kind of interesting, I am a centrist, from a political standpoint. And so I've tried to discuss some of the things around COVID and the election and what I'm seeing from a leadership standpoint. Not, to me, politics is policy. You're either talking about policy or power, but trying to talk about what we're seeing in terms of leadership and character and otherwise. And it's just interesting how many people are just, even today, I looked at 2 things from opposite ends of the spectrum. One was Democratic, one was Republican, but people just glamour onto what they want to glamour onto. And they say, you're so biased. And I wrote back to the person, I'm like, I'd love for you to how you think I'm biased. I've told you, I'm a registered independent. I'll vote across all sides of the spectrum, but it's been interesting. I think some people are don't wade into this stuff, and others are I appreciate this. This is reality. This is what's going on. I think topics like character and integrity, to ignore them, going on in the midst of a pandemic is kind of hard, at a federal and local level. But it is interesting. It has shown me too that some people are just so in a lens of, I wrote a few weeks ago, I think that I think our values used to determine our politics, and now I'm just seeing that our politics determine our values. And it just seems like a really weird flip of the filter, which my view is in this box, and therefore I'm willing to make my values malleable to stay there. And I just think that's dangerous stuff.
There's something else that I would stick in that equation. I think you're right that our values used to determine our politics, and there were goals that we had different ways of thinking were the right way to get there. And we could argue till the end of time about who was right. And you could
Yeah.
probably find data, like I could find you data to support why my side has done
Right.
the right thing. And
Or alternative data. Yeah.
or alternative, not alternative data, but being someone who works in data, I know that
Yeah.
it's as important what you leave out of deciding to share about your data as
Yeah.
what
You
you
can make
decide to
data
share.
say almost anything. Yeah.
You can just choose which data is the
Absolutely.
one you're going to focus on,
Yeah.
because not every data point serves your hypothesis. So why talk about it? But
Yeah.
but the thing is that I think now we also have, it's that our politics determine our values, but it's our version of reality is determining our politics, is determining our values, because there really are, when you look at the media landscape, there has become, I think, multiple versions
Yeah.
of reality and truth, that whole
It
truthiness
almost seems the crazier things that some people say, the more attention they get. Like the social media has just totally changed the equation, because as someone commented on my credibility quote this morning, they said, you used to have credibility to get an audience. Now you can get an audience, and
right.
people,
And
retweeting stuff, and that they don't, and it's dangerous. Like, you're implicitly endorsing it. So I critical thinking is just really dying as a skill. I think people will bend any reality into the narrative that they're trying to achieve, and I've just watched really intelligent people do this, and I it's, to me, it's a struggle.
I know it is. It's a little scary. I used to say, so I was one of those OG digital utopians of the early aughts who thought that social media was going to democratize history, basically. And that because the point I always used to make to my friends who were skeptical and would say, why should I listen to what this person says or that person says? And I said, for years, we all grew up, we talk about it as sort of halcyon days, that we grew up and there were three networks, and they were, Walter Cronkite and the anchors, and there was a couple of major national newspapers, but mostly we had our local, and we
Right.
had a couple of newspapers or a couple of news magazines, and the national network news. And all of that news was produced by people that probably 80 to 90% came from the same background, looked the same, had the same basic
Right.
life experience and perspective. And I was just saying, now, if you want to know what's happening on the ground in Syria, like go find an activist who's writing from
Right.
there. Now, if you
Right.
want to know, and also what ends up happening is, because that was so dominated, you have no sense of what it was like to really live through these times. We only have the broadest sense of what it's like because we're focused on war and commerce and government, and those don't tell you what it was like to live then. So I was a very much this,
Right.
that was homogenous in its own way, and that was therefore a limited perspective in its own way. But we have now swung the pendulum, because there's so much democratization.
Yeah, and we're just not willing to talk about leadership for anyone in a political position, or things that are objective. I look at Clinton, Bush, and Obama saying yesterday, we'll all get the vaccine together, like in public. Like, that's leadership. That's not politics. That's just leadership.
Yes.
That's like, we're going to lead by example, and do what we say. Like, yeah, it's so it's been interesting from a content standpoint. I think the times that I've taken the risk, I've gotten the most criticism and lost people, and at the same time, and I'm okay with that. I think it flushed out some people, but at the same time, it's meant the most. Like I said to someone this morning, I was like, if you believe in QAnon, like, please unsubscribe from my email list.
Right.
Like, we're not even I'm not even
I
going
always,
there. Yeah.
like I always say, I should be so lucky as to have a market of 100% of the people. I don't. So I'm happy to focus on 50% that are going to be, galvanized and inspired by what I have to say, and not worry so much about the people who are going to hate what I have to say. Well, like, okay, like no one's
And
asking you to
sometimes
hate.
they like one thing but hate another
Uh,
thing,
uh,
but it just shows dissonance, right? In
yes.
terms of like, when I always find that that's interesting. Like, I've been pretty consistent, in a bunch of my ratings, like, abound. And this was before, even this was earlier in the year. Just I don't like conspiracy theories, the whole,
Yeah.
and they're just growing like crazy. And look, if you've got 1 million of them, and people have written me back these crazy conspiracy theories, like, I'm just not your audience, like, for this.
We have a question from Facebook from Stephanie, who asks, do you have any specific tips about how to encourage particularly developers to escalate and bring up problems or roadblocks earlier rather than waiting till the last minute? What have you found has sort of really triggered that kind of, what I would say, that kind of trust and sort of teamwork?
Look, people, I think this is just a carrot stick thing, right? If you reward the behaviors that you want, this is when developers otherwise, if you call attention to, hey, developer A brought this problem up early and we resolved it, and celebrate that, then people will know that's okay. If you slap them on the hand for doing that, they'll know it's other okay. So there's so many subtle ways that we implicitly or explicitly, reward or sort of punish behavior. And I think the people learn and they figure it out, really quickly. The first time, someone comes to you with a problem or gives you feedback and you dismiss them, like it's the last time you're going to hear about a problem or feedback.
Oh, that is so true. I found myself on a call with a kind of new community that I'm sort of figuring out whether I want to be a part of. And they had said, okay, well, we were all in this huge Zoom. And they're like, well, if you have anything that, you want to weigh in, go ahead and unmute. And then, we'll get to chime in. So I unmuted, and like 20, I don't know, not even 5-10 seconds later, the host muted me. And I was like, oh, so you don't want me to.
Right.
And I was like, I'm out of here. Like, what is that? This is what I'm finding in these times. So I'm having much stronger reactions to small things, like the things that trigger an emotional response can be much smaller and they get a much stronger response. And I think it's because, there's like you said, not a lot of new things are happening. So the old things are like having way more impact.
We're very big on feedback in our company and getting feedback, and people get me feedback. And look, I've said things on company calls that I could have never imagined would have upset someone. And, but the feedback gets routed to me, and I tell people, thank you for the feedback. I mean, I don't agree with it, but thank you for the feedback. And because at least if I answer any other way, it will just shut it down. Right. So you don't have to agree with it, but you got to say, I heard you. Thank you. Let me think about that.
That's very critical. Building morale, teamwork, all those things doesn't mean you say yes all the time, but it means you do respond and respectfully.
I would say there are 3 buckets to feedback that we say, that's awesome, and we can fix that right away. That's really interesting, and it's a longer term solution, but we're going to look at it and we're not going to change that. Like, you're asking us, like we should get offices and have everyone work in them and whatever. Like, look, that's not, I think you got to be comfortable saying that stuff. Like, we have a very flexible culture. People have been like, let's do all summer, half Fridays off or half Mondays off. And I'll say, like, that's what you want. Don't make the assumption that everyone wants that. So we've created the flexible culture. If you want to take half Fridays off, you're welcome to do that, but we're not going to mandate that for the whole company.
Right. One more question from Facebook. What are your thoughts on a specific, how you communicate the team charter when you onboard people? How do you onboard people to make sure they're coming in with the best alignment and clarity?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty broad program, right? So they'll have their job functional stuff. They'll actually do a meeting with our president and talk about sort of our core operating stuff. And then I sit down with every group of new employees and go through our culture and our value and our histories and have a discussion about all that. So I still do those calls, and I think that's really important. So, and they get to ask me questions and talk about, all that stuff. So, we go pretty wide on that.
Cool. So we're at the top of the hour. I always like to close by asking my guests, where can people find you, sign up for what you want them to sign up for, buy what you want them to buy? Like, where's Robert Glazer online?
Sure. I think today they can get Friday Forward for free on Amazon. I actually think there was a promotion today for the Kindle version. But if you go to robertglazer, glazer.com, you can Friday Forwards there, books, podcasts, all that stuff. And I'm be launching a course on discovering your core values here in January.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Robert. It was
Thank you.
great to speak with you and to cover such a range of topics, but I thought it was both inspirational and actionable, which is super important. And as we said at the beginning, this is the weekly Remotely Fireside Chat. I'm Elisa Camahort Page, one of Remotely's founding advisors. You can go find out more about Remotely at remotely.global and learn about the membership at remotely.global/join and other events at remotely.global/events. And we will hope to see you at a future one. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks for joining us.